Hello, friends. My name is Host Eric. I'm the host of Talking with Famous People. And the person who's going to answer AsuraPsyche's questions, he posted in a comment on a recent video, which I greatly appreciate. And I respect the way that he approached it and the seriousness with which he put into thinking about what he was asking about. So here he says, I'm in a friendly, scholarly way interested in challenging your concept of TI as well as TI testing as a form of cognitive ranking of functions. And he says, to begin with, I think it is fundamentally incompatible with cognitive function model that suggests functions are information processing unit styles. So, okay, there's step one where we disagree. We can immediately eliminate that as an adequate definition for a cognitive function, because a cognitive function is best defined as a way of paying attention. Because people don't pay attention merely in information processing ways. This is a receiver bias definition, right? It says information's outside of me, I receive it. And those comprise cognitive functions. But I'm not receiving information or processing it right now. I'm putting information out there. I'm generating information. So we have to account for generating information. We have to account for receiving information and knowing things about it. We have to account for seeking and getting information and executing processes of deliberation on it. And we have to account for forms of action and interface that take place both communicatively and experientially. So ultimately, what we're talking about, if we want to have a good model of cognitive functions, we need to define a few things. We have to define what's a cognitive function. I define it as a way of paying attention, which requires me to then define attention. Attention is the willful application of the conscious self towards a given matter. Now, the thing that makes that a tricky definition in general is that receive functions seem like less matters of willful application than action functions. Deliberation functions seem more like matters of willful application than do knowledge functions. Interface functions seem more like matters of either willful application or receiving, depending on which end of the interface you're on, whether you're on the put or get end, Nevertheless, it is indisputably the case that if we're going to talk about how people pay attention, in other words, manners in which they willfully express their conscious being in the world, that we have to account for more than just information processing. So that's an inadequate definition right off the top. Now, if you want to have a fully realized definition, you need to position these things in a larger frame as well. So, okay, there's cognitive function is a way of paying attention. Attention is a willful application of the conscious self towards a given matter. What's cognitive function type? A type is a configuration of attentional manners that functions as a strategy towards attaining the prime directive. The prime directive being to close the gap between expectations and reality. So you can challenge any of these premises all you want, and that's fine. I'm not trying to say I've fully justified them in this short expose, but at least in this instance then, whenever we're talking about a type and whenever we're talking about a function, we can link it back to something to test to see if it withstands scrutiny as part of that definition. We can eliminate your definition right away because I can point to lots of things that are ways of paying attention that aren't about processing information. And I mean, there's just no disputing that, right? Whereas things that we have to consider in terms of a cognitive function model are all accounted for under way of paying attention with the way I define attention. Now, we also need to convert similarly between type and prime directive. In other words, well, why would this person behave accordingly when it doesn't seem to make sense from perspective, meow. Well, you can explain it in terms of how their stack defines their map and how their stack defines their territory and their relationship between the two. And ultimately, cognitive functions are about two things. People exist on a communicative level and they exist on an experiential level. So it's about map and territory and the relationship between those things. So let's scroll down a bit here and go to the next question by AsuraPsyche. How would a TI competency test be affected by an individual with either a gifted or on the opposite end disabled level IQ? Okay, so this is a category error. People think that gifted and disabled are two ends of the same spectrum of thing or something. Absolutely not. The reason people who have mental retardation is because there is something wrong with them. There's something different about them. The reason people are called gifted is because they have rich parents who get them labeled as such, mostly. Regardless, gifted is a bullshit term that doesn't mean anything, okay? But whereas mentally disabled does mean something and can be linked to a specific cause and reason for deviance from what a normal person is, okay? We would expect a gifted individual, no matter the type, to be able to solve deductive logic problems with relative ease. Your expectation then would be crushed. Or you'd have to concede that certain types, ENFPs, ESFPs, can't be gifted. What you've done here is linked explicitly the notion of giftedness to being good at TI problems for no particular reason. Especially if you were to give them the same questions as the rest of the population. Not true. ESFPs, ENFPs, no matter how gifted they may seem, on certain metrics, will utterly fail those TI questions. And the reason is because it's not because introverted thinking is the same thing as verbal reasoning. That's not why, and I'll get to what it is in a second. So does your TI testing system account for cognitive intellectual variance? So to answer this question, within a given population of ducks, you're going to have some who are larger, some who are smaller, some who are better at swimming, some who are worse at swimming, some who are better at flying, some who are worse at flying. And you're not going to have any that are particularly good at walking on land compared to, say, human beings, right? So there's going to be variance within the population. And what I've said about my TI test results before is because of that variance within the population, the only meaningful thing I can determine with the TI test is one or two, first or second slot, seventh slot, or something else. So it's not super precise because it's not ultimately a test of TI itself. It's a test of a skill that links closely to TI. And I think that's basically what you're asking in the next section, so let me get to that. Does competency in a skill or style of thinking, such as deductive logic, have a causal relationship directly with specific cognitive functions? Well, no, it doesn't cause cognitive functions. If you mean, do cognitive functions cause that? No, it's a strong correlation. Let me explain exactly why. So basically what introverted thinking is it's a deliberative function that deals with mapping matters. Whereas introverted feeling is a deliberative function that deals with territory matters. So if I say to, like in the example in the video that you commented on, I talked about the 6-year-old and 9-year-old. The 6-year-old is told, if only Egyptians build pyramids and you build a pyramid, are you an Egyptian? And he says, well, yeah, I guess I must be at least part Egyptian because if only Egyptians build pyramids. So the thing is, you might say, how dumb, how stupid. That child is not noting the fact that he's definitely not Egyptian, that he hasn't built a pyramid, and the whole question is irrelevant. But instead what we see revealed in that 6-year-old's response is that TI is a frame of reference. It's a frame of reference that understands words through a mapping perspective, that assumes the words are being used for some mapping purpose. So TI perspective understands that words have definitions. Those definitions can change depending on context, and in fact, that you can, by agreement, define something as something else for the sake of argument. Let's pretend all A's are B's. Now, wouldn't it be the case necessarily that blah, 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 blah is revelatory of a tendency to deal with language as though it were a tool to get from understanding A to understanding B, and not necessarily a tool to get clarity regarding reality itself. In other words, when we test somebody's native understanding of validity, if some squirrels run up the tree, and all things that run up trees have hats, is it necessarily the case that some squirrels have hats? The answer is yes. So what we're doing there is saying this is what is true about the mapping tools we use. This is what is true about the word if. This is what is true about the word then. we're talking about conditionalities, right? So that verbal reasoning skill and deftness with conditionalities isn't caused exactly by the cognitive function introverted thinking, but it naturally emerges as a consequence of the fact that the individuals focused on the words as tools of mapping, not as linkages to reality. On the other hand, if you begin with the notion that you have a feeling that's challenging to express in words because it's so much of it is experiential, and the capacity of us to convey our own experiences in ways that other people understand is contingent upon them having comparable experiences to reference. We can't share directly the moisture of our feelings with somebody. Instead, we have to reference equivalents for them to know what we're feeling. So we use a word like sad. People come to associate that with their own experience of sadness. And then when somebody else says, I feel sad, you know what they mean. But you can't use it for any kind of an argument. It's not the sort of thing that's a good mapping tool because it's an end status. It's not something that you use to open up more of the map. Okay, so higher TI equals higher deductive. Higher TI equals value per leads to higher deductive reasoning versus higher TI leads to value for deductive styles of reasoning versus leads to higher deductive. It's none of those. It's higher TI leads to higher attention, more attention, or attention to words as though they were mapping tools. In other words, attention to language via the frame of reference of TI, which is a mapping frame of reference, which leads to treating words as though they are variables that can be exchanged with other words, which leads to prioritizing what one can do with the words that don't have shifting meanings, which are the statement connectives, if, then, and, or, not. And which then leads to an understanding of reality that says words are used to draw conclusions about words, not about reality. And that leads to better deductive reasoning in general. And remember, as I said, I only can conclude certain things. There is natural variability within the types. So, while it's true that every TI DOM and every TI tool user will perform very well on the TI tests, it's not true that every fourth slot TI user will perform more poorly than every third slot. It's not. You can't draw conclusions like that. It is true that only polar will appear to be blind to the very frame of reference. And this is exemplified best by the ESFP I typed one time, and I asked them, who is your mother's sister in relation to you? And she said, family? That's not getting the idea that you're asking a person to use mapping tools to draw mapping conclusions, not linking it all to reality. And if you're TI polar, no matter how brilliant you are in other things, and there's lots of other ways to be smart, no matter how gifted you are, you will do terribly on TI tests. You could, in theory, brute force your way through accumulating heuristic strategies of solving TI problems, but it would be incredibly heavy lift. I've taught logic before, so I know how that goes. I've tried to teach it in ways that were more conducive to TE people being successful, which meant use this strategy when you encounter this thing, and that you can accomplish some success with that. But nevertheless, the way that the TI questions are asked on the fly, asking them to use their heads and not pieces of paper and stuff, you can measure the amount of speed or responsiveness they have to it. You can measure how much it links to SI by asking long or short genealogy questions. There's all sorts of things you can measure there that aren't exactly measuring the cognitive function itself, right? Because to try to distinguish it as a distinct thing like that is already kind of a mistake. Remember, a cognitive function is a way that you express your being, ultimately. Okay, so let's go down a little bit further and see what else we got here. If TI has a competency aspect associated with it, that implies that all cognitive functions have the same competency aspect. They do. But I don't have tests for all of them because not all the competencies. See, this is where the information processing problem comes in. TI is an information processing function. FI is an information processing function. We can test TI's information processing function because it's an external, objective, universal kind of thing. In other words, it deals with the logic of language, which is the one universal logic. Everything else has its own distinct logics, and that's what TE deals with, okay? So, do you believe all functions could have competency tests associated? Well, I believe all functions have competencies associated with them, but not all competencies are testable really by other people. So it's a lot harder to come up with competency tests for introverted intuition than it is for introverted thinking, because introverted thinking is our most shared thing. In other words, we're all using language. We all, to some extent, have to mean specific things when we say stuff. And if, and, or, not, then, if and only if, those words have only one meaning, right? It's like when used to express relationships between things, what they do is they allow us to draw truth value distinctions. So if I say I have a lighter and a banana in my hand, it's false, because I'd have to have both. If I say I have a lighter or a banana in my hand, it's true, because I'd only need to have one. And the only difference between those statements is the word and or. And tells us I'm making two claims, or tells us I'm making one claim about two things. And these are mapping issues that a TI person who's rejecting the high resolution, difficult to parse out emotional vector calculations is instead naturally going to these more communicatively realized ways, because they're fundamentally attending towards and within a communicative framework when deliberating. Okay. And the thing is, AsuraPsyche, and this is something important to remember, and I know that you're going to undervalue this because it's an SI thing, right? It's an example and experience thing. But I have seen these tests hold up time and time and time and time and time and time again, testing many, many people. When I come across an extroverted intuition dominant, they're either going to perform extremely well on TI test or extremely poorly and nothing in between. And that's been consistently upheld. When I come across somebody who's SI polar and very, very obvious about it, they will consistently test out as ENTJ across the board. Note that the problem here that AsuraPsyche is getting at is this, and it is important to emphasize the competency aspect of the questions as opposed to something that is non-competency related. Can we rank FI based on correct or well? So no, that's what makes typing still an art, not just a science, is I don't have such clear-cut tests as those that can test as skills that I can evoke as subjects. And that's the other important thing to remember, is that people engage with these cognitive functions in several ways, okay? They engage with them as subjects. That's the kind that's easiest to test. We can provoke people to behave as subjects in a given fashion by asking certain kinds of questions. So that's the easiest kind to test. But that's only 1/3 of the equation. There's also how people respond being the object of somebody else's attentional manner, and how people engage a given frame of reference as an agent or as a knower, right? And the stack and those three angles or perspectives, plus the two fundamental fields, that is to say metaphysical and physical, and the two halves of those fields, internal and external, the interaction of those three mechanics, namely the fact that there are three perspectives, subject, object, agent, there are four fields, internal metaphysical, external metaphysical, internal physical, external metaphysical. and the fact that functions engage with those within two kinds of thing, which is communicative and experiential. Those interactions of vectors and possible ways of engaging with those fields and stuff, that explains cognitive functions. I mean, I didn't just explain it right there, but that's where the explanation comes from in full, is when you understand the mechanics, you're recognizing that the reason why my third slot FE is the way that it is, which is like I'm much more desirous of receiving your FE than I'm likely to give somebody else FE, although I do some of that, right? And I'm much more capable of knowing how something plays on FE grounds than I am on successfully manifesting the FE response I want. These things stem from the fact that I'm foremost a subject function in NE, secondarily an object function in TI, and only tertiarily, therefore, definitionally, my third slot is going to lean heavily towards the agency aspect of things. And you can see that in how I find it almost impossible to watch even a funny movie that makes me cringe, because I'm most operant as an agent on FE grounds. So, now this thing, two people of two different types with different functions come to the same conclusion. This is what I was talking about just recently in last night's live stream or something. To correctly understand cognitive functions, we have to be able to answer this question. I have 3 different people here who are all engaged in the same behavior from similar circumstances. And yet, we've already typed them all and we know they're 3 different types. What would be the difference in the process by which they attained the same outcomes? And of course, that's how you know you've got a good explanation of cognitive functions. A bad way of approaching cognitive functions is saying, let's look at behaviors and see which behaviors correlate most with types. The reason that's a bad way of doing things is because, like AsuraPsyche says here, you can have different types of people engage in the same behavior. To type them, then, you need to ask why or tell me more or something like that and get some actual juice out of them. The example I've used lately has been the ESTP who didn't like the movie John Wick. Now, if you're a normal typologist, you might make the mistake of thinking, okay, liking John Wick is something that correlates with being an ESTP, and so if you don't like it, you're probably not an ESFP or something like that. But a good typologist will say, okay, well, can you explain to me why you didn't like it? And the answer of the ESTP was entirely consistent with and reflective of and expressive of what I say about first and fifth slot absolute values. She complained about the unrealisticness of people always missing, shooting at him a million times, and everybody missed him getting missed by all those bullets. And she talked about how she didn't like the fact that for a brief period of time towards the beginning of the movie, he was a total wimp and got beat up by those Russian guys. But then every other instance in the movie, before and after, he was a super badass. So there was an SI inconsistency there. So in other words, the ESTP was expressing distaste for the failure of the movie to account for experiential consistency producing, linking to identity, okay? And she was complaining because it didn't address matters of impact honestly in a nuanced way. It addressed them in a very unnuanced way and treated it just as if you have a nuanced understanding of SE, you're going to quickly say, well, there's no reason to ever feel any concern that he's going to be shot, because obviously the movie's not caring about reality at all in this area, or else not all of those people would have missed him so far. That's kind of a more nuanced understanding of SE when you're watching an SE kind of movie like John Wick, right? So the thing is, it is important for us to be able to differentiate between behaviors and functions. And we learn a lot more about functions when we ask somebody why they don't like this, why they did that, why they blah, 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 than simply noting what they self-identify as or observing them doing it and drawing conclusions. And the primary reason for this is, of the 3 perspectives through which a given individual exists, agent, subject, object, only subject is especially visible to the typologist unless they're aware of this differentiation in perspectives and can try to draw them out and draw the distinctions accordingly. So AsuraPsyche asks some good questions, but if you're engaged intellectually honestly with what I'm saying here, then you're going to recognize that I'm right. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to eat plenty of cheese.